leadership to start taking the talks to the provincial and federal regulators. They will provide guidance on how to best proceed with that work. Donna Khanna will provide IT expertise on providing tracking and logistic practices. This work will not be done underway until the regulations are drafted, but it will be a critical part of the health and safety aspects of the industry, as well as helping to calculate what the community can. One of our most significant developments was the completion of the Six Nations Cannabis Commission Constitution. This was the primary focus of the Commission's task and replaces the Commission terms of reference in the current Six Nations Cannabis Control Law. It outlines our governance structures and lays out how the Commission will operate as an arm's length entity to the elected council, eventually becoming a standalone regulator. This is before the elected council now for review. Once that item is finalized, which we anticipate will be by the end of the month of July, we will begin the process of filling commission vacancies and establishing an advisory committee. We determined that the best course of action for the commissioners to begin recruitment for potential candidates is to fulfill these positions, to fill these positions, and then to draft a short list of applicants for selection. The advisory committee structure and candidates will be part of the discussions in finalizing the commission's constitution. We will keep the community updated on both commissioner vacancies and advisory committee positions as soon as those are finalized. An update from our commission staffing. So job descriptions for our administrative support team are being completed now. We are preparing to hire a project manager and an administrative assistant sometime this month. Closer to the fall, a financial manager position will also be drafted. Commissioners will continue to carry out administrative duties through the months of September, at which point in the workplace those positions will be filled. Right now, there are 3 phases in our roadmap to licensing. Preliminary matters, which is now 99% complete. Regulatory model planning, which is underway now, and our regulatory design and implementation, which has a proposed start date of mid-September. It is important to note that we anticipate the applications for production will be ready in 5 months, November 2020. And applications for cannabis dispensaries will be ready in spring of 2021. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Cole. So I'm going to turn things over to Kim Thomas. Kim is going to give a breakdown of some of the policy determination things that we're looking at right now. Kim?
Good afternoon, now is Scanos Wagwego. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be part of this very exciting initiative and this very professional team that we have in place to support the Commission. As Nanda was saying, it's very clear from the community feedback that we got that there were 4 key principles that the community wanted to ensure are upheld through the regulation of the cannabis industry. First and foremost, health and safety was a key consideration, protection of the environment, ensuring that there was community contribution, that the community would see benefits from the industry, and that there would not be a monopoly on the industry. So Jeremy and I were brought on, along with Can Delta, to start looking at the legal issues as well as the regulatory issues of the industry. It became very clear early on that this was a very unique, very complex, and very groundbreaking initiative. And also very exciting because it's the opportunity for Six Nations to advance in a unified fashion, self-sufficiency, so that all of our community can benefit from this industry. So to look at meeting those 4 key priorities, it was important for us to ensure that we had experts in all of those fields. We needed to look at a business plan for the industry, what that financial model might look like, and we needed to look at how we could best protect the environment. Left unregulated, there are very serious potential environmental concerns that can happen on the production side, and we wanted to ensure that we were covering all of those risks when we were looking at the market and what our community can bear in terms of the environmental considerations. Within all of those streams of work, there's also a number of deliverables. Some of them can happen in parallel, but some of them have to happen in sequence. And that we understand that there's frustration with the time frame. When you see the models that Sherry's going to present, you'll understand more how complex it is to actually create a regulated industry from the ground up. We want something that is safe, as well as it has to be reflective of our own people. So it's not a matter of just copying what the federal government has done or the provincial government has done. We have to ensure that it fits for our community. So we have to ensure that all of these work streams are happening in a very integrated fashion. And as I mentioned, some can happen in parallel, but some have to happen in sequence. And there's a lot of policy considerations that have to go into the redrafting of the cannabis control law. There's a lot of feedback that we obtained from the community, and we're going through that very carefully to ensure that the revisions to the Six Nations Cannabis Control Law factors in that community input. And from there, we would draft the regulations. It's not as easy as just simply putting pen to paper and revising the law and drafting the regulations. We have to make sure the community input is there, and we have to look at those key policy considerations as well. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy to just talk through some of the examples of the policy considerations that we are looking at. And he will summarize those and then turn it over to Sherry to start presenting the 4 models that we looked at for the industry. So with that, Jeremy.
Thanks, Kim. And that's exactly right. There are sort of a handful of specific policy categories of issues that we're analyzing and that we've provided analysis to the commission for, to help them consider what the amended cannabis control law and the regulations and the regulator operational policies and governance should look like. There's some buckets that I can sort of share with you guys that we've been analyzing. The first one is really incorporating specific community input. That's a target of its own. Evaluating jurisdictional considerations is also relevant. Neighboring jurisdictional considerations, the degree to which it makes sense for Six Nations to harmonize with the federal and provincial statutes, or where simplifications and improvements and customizations can be made that are needed for Six Nations or best for Six Nations. Land use considerations is also a very significant bucket in the circumstances. There aren't land use control laws on Six Nations, and cannabis, as Kim mentioned, and everybody knows, has potentially significant environmental impacts, and Six Nations has a limited land base. There's also an analysis of whether to build in a separate medical cannabis regime and what that would look like. The federal model is unduly, formed in a way that we don't need to replicate, certainly at Six Nations, and there's better ways to do that. So figuring out how that's going to work best is also fairly elaborate. I want to get back just quickly before I hand it off to Sherry on some of the integration that Kim was talking about, the things that, the reason that we can't just do everything at once in 4 to 6 weeks, in addition to these sort of very in-depth policy considerations, that you need to do to get it right. Some of the things that have to happen in sequence and can't happen in parallel, we put together a few examples. An industry financial model. So MNP as business analysts are preparing business modeling, industry modeling, so that we know how to structure the regulatory regime, and a couple of specific spots where that's relevant is we want to have a community contribution, and we want to make sure that we can set a community contribution level that's not going to be unduly onerous on industry participants. You set it too high and you're kneecapping businesses, and that's not anybody's intention. The business model and market analysis is also important for in the context of establishing applicant eligibility and permitting qualifications so that we can ensure a level playing field for potential industry participants, minimize the risk of monopolization, for example. On the environment, because of Six Nations limited land base and the absence of zoning bylaws or land use plans, and together with the potential environmental impacts of cannabis, all of that requires fairly elaborate consideration. And we have my firm, we've engaged land use law experts, and as well as Pynchon on the environmental assessment side and analysis side, to help us ensure that we can have risk mitigation measures that are in place. And all of that needs to be done before we start amending the law. You don't write first and figure it out later. That just, it will lead to bad outcomes. So those are some of the things that have to be done in sequence, and that's really just a small handful. There are dozens. The work plans that are being prepared for this project are very elaborate, and we're certainly not going to get into that kind of detail right now, but it's not a short-term job, and that's what we would love to avoid the industry's frustration with the timeline. And if we could do that, we would, but it's just not possible. And I think Wayne's going to speak a little bit to that later. But at that point, Sherry or Nanda, do you want to move on to the next section?
Sure, I could jump in. Hi, everyone. I'm Sherry Boudreau. I'm the lead compliance consultant from CanDelta on the project, and I'm pleased to speak with you today. So just some quick background on me. So CanDelta is a regulatory consulting company in Toronto, and we've been brought into the project really to provide insight and experience, including some lessons learned from the existing federal and provincial cannabis regimes, and apply these to the cannabis regulated regime at Six Nations that really fits with your community. So for us, it's not a cookie cutter approach. We're not trying to take every single part of what's currently there and in the federal and provincial regimes and apply to Six Nations, because we understand that your community has very specific priorities that we're trying to achieve, and your community engagement and input is very important to us. So on the screen, so Nanda, are you able to share the infographic on your screen?
Yeah.
Thanks. Great. Okay, so on the screen now, you should be able to see an infographic, which I'll walk you through. And it outlines an industry overview and what we've identified as realistic industry options for the Six Nations community. We've identified 4 industry options: unregulated, moratorium, federal, provincial, and Six Nations regulated industry. Now, we've assessed each industry listed here, including the pros and cons, with an open mind and taking into consideration the community's North Star principles at the forefront of our assessment. And these principles are reiterated at the top of the infographic, which includes safety of people, environmental protection, competitive industry, and community benefit. So it was very important for us as a project team working with the Commission that when performing this assessment, that we keep these North Star principles in mind, because these are the vocalized priorities of the community. And if it's important to the community, then it's important to us as well. Okay, so let's begin with the first column here. So this is the unregulated industry. So the first point here states that there's really no set established rules in an unregulated industry. So this creates a challenge for the local police. Their enforcement would therefore have to be very broad, and it's really up to them at that point on what they're going to be enforcing and how they're really going to put forth any punishments. And it's hard also for the community members when there are no set standards or guidelines to follow. So at the end of the day, it becomes very challenging, and that incurs additional costs and resources associated with that type of enforcement. There's no oversight of facility development. The facility owners at that point will construct their facilities based on how they see fit. They'll be using materials that are not necessarily conducive to product quality So in that sense, there's going to be a lot of inconsistency across the board on how the facilities are built, and also how that impacts the environment. As Jeremy has mentioned, there is some limitation on the land base of the community, so it's very important to be able to consider, even at the early stages of building a facility, how that's going to impact the environment. There's no control, transparency of product quality, and that includes testing of hazards or cross-contamination of legal drugs. So there are no set standards for facility owners to stand by when they are producing cannabis. There's no testing involved. They don't know what to test or what to refer to. And we do know that there have been some unfortunate situations in the community where there have been cannabis that has been laced with fentanyl. And there's really no transparency there for the consumer on what is being done at the production level. An unregulated industry continues to foster illicit market and criminal activity with no option for legitimacy. So they're really stuck into that mold. They can't, if there's no option for them to get out of that, then that's where they're likely going to stay, and it really perpetuates a lot of these issues. An unregulated industry is not aligned with vocalized community priorities, and this links back up to the North Star principles at the top here, which has really been reiterated by the community, throughout many of the community engagements. So we do know this is something that the community really does want, and an unregulated industry does not align with that. There is still legal access through provincial authorized retailers, and this is the only, legal way of obtaining cannabis, and that would have to be outside of the community. And in doing so, there's no financial benefits to the Six Nations community. All of that financing, all of the finances that will come out of a legal industry and going out of the community to purchase product will go directly to the provincial market. This also perpetuates illicit monopoly being created within the community. It provides only opportunities for certain individuals who are looking to stay in an unregulated market, and there's no real opportunities outside of that. An unregulated industry does not permit the opportunity to negotiate with provincial and federal governments, because these governments cannot negotiate with an industry that's unregulated. That's just not something that there's a mechanism for them to do. So that really creates a huge disadvantage. And outside governments, so federal and provincial governments, in that case, do have an opportunity to come in and try to enforce their existing laws, and causing unnecessary jurisdictional issues. So that is creating a whole new set of issues. So let's look at the second column now, a moratorium. So with the moratorium, there's prohibition on the activity as a whole. So there's a complete ban on any cannabis activities within the community. That requires strict enforcement to ensure the banned activities are never performed. And that will then create an additional cost and resources on enforcement, even within the local Six Nations police. Since the cannabis activities and products are banned outright, there is no real impact on the environment at that point, because realistically there should be no cannabis produced. That doesn't say that there would be individuals who are potentially still trying to produce cannabis where they're not supposed to, but in following the moratorium, there should be a facility. The facility should be banned outright. Products are also banned outright, so this fails any control of quality cannabis that may still exist. There's no real mechanism to be able to test those products at that point, because all of the products should be essentially banned, although there is still a good likelihood that there are a lot of illicit products that are still out in the community. This also entrenches the illicit market and fosters criminal activity. So this isn't necessarily helping the situation. It's a politically very unfavorable, unpopular option given legalization at the federal level. There is legal access through provincial authorized retailers, as I mentioned, also for the unregulated industry, but again, that's going outside of the community, and that may pose no financial benefit to the Six Nations community. It encourages opportunity for an illicit monopoly, and again, that's one of the points that the community is really trying to not encourage. It does permit the opportunity to negotiate with provincial and federal governments. So it's not really an unregulated industry at this point. There has been a ban, and it does allow opportunity for external governments to come in. But again, that may cause some other jurisdictional issues. Now moving on to the third column, federal, provincial. So this involves the two levels of external governments overseeing a local industry, including things like site inspections, and that would involve an additional cost and resources with enforcement, but it's subject to the tripartite agreement. So that would involve the RCMP at the federal level, the OPP at the provincial level, and the Six Nations police at the community level. With the federal and provincial regime, it would establish facility design. So with built in to the federal regime right now, there are very prescriptive guidelines on how facilities should be built. So with that in mind, it's to be able to ensure that there are quality products, things like the material of, the construction material of the building, things like having filters for odor control, sanitation procedures. So all of that is built into the regulations already to ensure that when the facility is being built, this is taken into consideration with the end goal of having safe product. And this includes also product testing requirements at an established lab that's approved by Health Canada with very set standards on how to release the product, and a lot of transparency on the packaging as well, so that consumers know exactly what they're consuming. So there's a lot of control and transparency over safe product. This gives an option for legality to reduce criminal activity. However, this doesn't necessarily align with the community preference for self-determination. The facilities that are established require elected council approval via BCR, and contribution will go to the federal and provincial governments, and the Six Nations portion goes directly to the elected system to determine any financial benefit to the Six Nations community. There will still be legal access through provincial, federal retailers only. So this is for, akin to a dispensary, but it will be at the provincial level by authorized retailers approved by the provincial government. And this will prevent a monopoly from being created because the only legal route is really through the federal and provincial avenues. It does not, however, permit the opportunity to negotiate with the provincial and federal governments, because at this point you're opting to follow their regulations. And the last column here is a Six Nations regulated industry option. So right now, time has been invested by the Six Nations to build a local industry already underway, to ensure accountability of licensed business owners. So in establishing a regulated industry within Six Nations, the business owners will be accountable by showing transparency in order to essentially keep their license. There will be additional costs for establishing and administering the regulatory regime, including enforcement. And there will be oversight on environmental matters. So that's one thing that we're really taking into consideration. As we mentioned, we brought in an environmental consultant, Pinchin, to take a look and assess really what would be the best course of action to be able to meet all of the community needs. There will be control and transparency over safe products, and that will be achieved by rigorous and robust analytical testing parameters, which we'll establish, which is common for cannabis products, which is often used at the federal level, not just in Canada, but internationally. and also including any other parameter that the community might want to take into consideration. For example, testing of any illicit substances like fentanyl, if that's an issue in your community. So these testing standards could actually be better than the federal regime if we're tailoring it very specifically to your community needs. This option to become have a legal industry within Six Nations provide another option. So people do and can have the option to legitimize, which would reduce criminal activity. It allows for self-determination. Cannabis will be under the Six Nations jurisdiction. And there are options to provide direct financial benefits to the Six Nations community. This is also advantageous as it prevents any monopoly from forming within the community. And it also permits an opportunity to negotiate with provincial and federal governments if desired. And this is something that has been looked at and is continuing to be looked at to ensure that there is an open way for communication between the Six Nations and the federal and provincial governments to see how we could work together. There would be preference for legal access given to Six Nations dispensaries over provincial authorized retailers. So the goal here is now that, if you have an option for dispensaries within the community, you don't have to necessarily go out and only obtain cannabis through legal access through provincial retailers. So it is really bringing back a lot of the onus on the Six Nations to be able to provide safe product to their community members. So I know there's a lot of information here. The goal is really just to be able to have a visual of all of the options within the Six Nations community for an industry, and we could see where we are right now and what the options are and where we could be heading. And based on what we have here, a Six Nations regulated industry is a very realistic option, and it's highly worth considering. And with that being said, I guess we'll turn it over to Wayne Greer, who is a project manager, and he'll be discussing the next 3 months.
Wayne, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but you're on mute.
Thanks, Nanda. Appreciate that. And it was a good start to my speech, by the way. Our role as project advisors is to develop the path forward, ensuring that the project team is meeting the goals and objectives of the North Star principles. This project is like no other. It is designed to be a seed to sale model with all of the activities happening within the territory of the Six Nations of the Grand River. We have no blueprint to work from, and no First Nations government has ever tackled this type of initiative or asserted its sovereignty in this way. To get it right and to minimize the risks to everyone involved, including prosecution risk, we have to create a framework that will, at its core, defend the position taken to build this industry. Some people may not agree with the timeline, but the list of tasks is quite substantial to balance all of these interests. As you have heard earlier, we have been working hard to lay the foundation. You have met some members of the team that we've assembled to complete the work. Collectively, we are nearing the end of the foundational tasks. Over the next 3 months, we'll be adding to the foundation that has been built. The team will be working to complete a number of key legal and regulatory tasks. They will continue working on market foundations with the business plan and additional market research. Other key initiatives that have been launched include defining operational policies, environment, jurisdictional strategy, and finalizing how to ensure compliance with the key North Star principles. Membership engagement is scheduled to happen every 12 weeks. And at these future sessions, we will provide you with an update on what has been accomplished, as well as the list of the activities being undertaken over the next 12 weeks. We may not be able to move the time milestones forward as some activities must fall in sequence. Policy determination before creating operational policies as an example. However, you can be assured that we will do our best to find ways to reduce the time currently anticipated to go through the project steps. So part of our goal here is to be aware and sustain the principles, make sure the team is working cohesively. We are trying to work as fast as we can, but we have to do things in order and we have to do them right. And we have no blueprint to work from, so we are trying to lay it out as best we can. And it is, and as we have presented to the chief and council, it is evergreen, and we will do our best to move things around as we move forward. Nanda?
Thanks so much, Wayne. So I wanted to open up the discussion for anyone who has any questions. There's a question and answer service within this Zoom webinar, so you can just type your question in and we will pass those along to our panelists. I guess I wanted to pass something over to Sherry. If you can just explain a little bit about the risks associated with dispensaries selling black market product. So what could happen to a person, or what are the risks of people using black market or illicit cannabis?
Sure. So the issue with obtaining black market cannabis from a dispensary is essentially that there is not enough information of the product on the product itself. So in terms of what is on any of the labeling, if there even is any labeling, details of what has been tested on that cannabis product is not available to the consumer. So there are certain very well-known substances that are used on cannabis during the production stages that can trickle down to the product and pose a very high risk of illness. So for example, cannabis products can have high levels of heavy metals, high levels of pesticides that are unauthorized to be used from a pesticide perspective on cannabis itself as a plant. There can be microbial contamination just from bacteria or other fungus that are harbored in the growing process. There can be residual solvents, so things like butane. So if people are producing any extracts using butane, that can also be at higher levels, even ethanol. So depending on the testing, it would be able to determine if the levels of any of those things I just mentioned are exceeding what's acceptable, or that it's even present, because some of these substances are, shouldn't even be in a product at all. So without that information and transparency of the product, of those types of substances being applied to the cannabis, the user can then consume that cannabis product and then fall ill. So illnesses can include things like respiratory issues, especially if someone is taking cannabis products and they already have a compromised immune system. Things like increased levels of ethanol can cause things like blindness. There can be immobility, and in the worst case scenario, of course, is death. So if there are things like, it being laced with fentanyl or having high levels of pesticide, the ultimate issue here is death. And I think that, that alone speaks to the seriousness of the situation if cannabis is not, tested properly, and that information is not clearly provided to the consumer.
Right. Right. Okay. Thank you. That was one item that I thought was important also to bring forward. And Kim, I'm going to turn this question over to you. Is if someone obtains illicit cannabis from an illegal dispensary and they do they get harmed in the process of consuming that, what are some of the potential civil liabilities that could happen to a dispensary owner if that situation were to occur?
Certainly, if there was loss of life, then that's personal damages for that person and potentially their heirs, their estate. You are under Canadian law, a status Indian can sue another status Indian and recover damages. If the consumer was not a status Indian and the retailer was, then you would be protected through the Indian Act. Section 89 prevents recovery against a status Indian or any of their assets on reserve. If that retailer had assets off reserve, those would be subject to seizure. So that's in a nutshell, just some of the civil liabilities. I don't know if Jeremy wanted to add anything to that.
Jeremy, I think you responded, but you had your microphone muted.
Sorry, I just said I didn't have anything to add. I thought that summed it up well.
All right, thank you. So if there are any further questions, feel free to input them into our question and answer section. If not, I think we can just sum up our presentation. And I'm not seeing any further questions coming through. Okay, yep, I'm not seeing any further questions coming through. So thank you everybody for all of your time, for the work that you're putting in. This is just such an amazing team to be able to work with. I really appreciate all of your time. And we believe that the next update will be in 12 weeks. So that's 3 months. If there's anything urgent in the meantime to bring forward to the community, absolutely it will be brought forward. Thank you guys for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Nanda.
Thank you.
Thank you.